What is up, Musical Talk fans? My name is Mike Shapiro. Have you ever sat down with a friend or colleague and gotten so engrossed in the conversation that time just seemed to fly away? Well, such was the case when I sat down with Dominic McChesney, each of us in our respective corners of the world, to discuss one of the less well-known musicals composed by Sir Andrew Lloyd Webber, namely by Jeeves. I'm not sure what happened. I think it's just because Dom is such an agreeable person and so knowledgeable about musical theater. In any case, I am pleased to present this chat, which runs about half as long as the show in question. Enjoy. Dom, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, given the circumstances that we're all contending with at the moment.
Yes, I've just made myself laugh because I didn't sound like Joey. I didn't have a New Jersey accent then. I should have said, how are you doing? But my accents are terrible. But how are you doing?
Yeah, there's no need to waste a perfectly good British accent trying to make it sound like a TV American accent.
No. Quite right, too. Yes, I'm doing fine. You know, it is, like you said, it's a bit of a nutty situation, but some days are better than others, but...
But one silver lining of the current quarantine that we're all dealing with is the resurgence of a number of filmed productions of musical theater that have been made available as kind of a gesture of generosity. We're seeing offerings that are free for a weekend or some short period of time, or in other cases, it seems like people are just putting productions online forever.
Yes, it is quite fantastic. I think there's been some real gems have suddenly surfaced, and occasionally the odd, probably illegal bootleg I've suddenly seen crop up for about an hour on YouTube and then suddenly disappear now and again. But it is quite nice to suddenly see things because at least it does, although it reminds you of what we're kind of missing at the moment, it does remind you of the joy of live theatre and seeing an audience watching a show and having, you know, all these wonderful filmed performances.
I much agree. And of course, nothing compares to the experience of being in a theater and watching a show live. If that's not available, seeing a filmed live production can offer some of that experience. And I think it keeps us connected to theater. It makes us not forget what that experience is like through a stand-in.
Yes, I absolutely agree. I mean, they've had the event cinema for some time now, haven't they? And when I was living in Mexico, the local cinema would often show some of the NT live performances and ballets and musicals. And so that was an absolute joy to go and see those because I did get that feeling of being able to see one of the big shows. And you're sat in an audience on the screen. So it's kind of a weird double audience effect. I've actually just bought... This is a bit mad in a weird whim of mine. I actually bought a projector, and so I can shine it on my wall and turn my settee around so it makes me feel like I'm sitting in a cinema. But I haven't tried it on any filmed shows yet, but I shall do.
Some productions are ingenious in their attempt to give you a sense of being in an audience. So rather than just launching into the show, they will give you a little bit of atmosphere and environment and perhaps simulate the experience of sitting down by showing you your hypothetical neighboring seats and otherwise conveying the atmosphere of a show.
Yes, indeed. And in fact, I think a very good case of that is probably the one we're going to talk about today, which then does it again in another way, don't they? Because we've actually got a fully costumed audience, which is quite odd.
Yeah, you could say that if part of a filmed production's goal is to make a remote viewer feel like they're present, then an interesting example of that effort comes through Sir Andrew Lloyd Webber. He's a sir, right? He's been knighted.
He is, yes.
So he could theoretically be deployed into combat at any time.
Theoretically, yes.
That would certainly throw the enemy for a loop, seeing Andrew Lloyd Webber coming at them. But he's been very generous in allowing filmed productions of his various shows to be aired for limited times during subsequent weekends.
Yes.
I think there's a name for this series, something like The Show Will Go On or something along those lines.
I think that's right. I actually don't know because I've actually only watched the one we're going to talk about. Yes.
Indeed. Well, we've been coy in not mentioning it. So the show in question is one of Andrew Lloyd Webber's lesser-known works, and it is called, in its most recent incarnation, By Jeeves.
Indeed.
And if the name Jeeves sounds familiar, like a trope from literary culture, it's because it's the name of a butler in a famous series of novels written by, I presume, British novelist P.G. Wodehouse.
That's correct, yes.
An extremely British-sounding name, so it just has to be.
It is.
And Andrew Lloyd Webber and book writer / lyricist Alan Ayckbourn, or Ayckbourn? Ayckbourn, thank you.
Yes.
Adapted one of these books, or perhaps combined several stories from a couple of the books into a musical. And one production of this musical is one of the offerings that is being streamed or was streamed recently for public viewing. So as I understand it, there was an earlier version of the show in the 70s, and you are fairly familiar with that, and I am not. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that incarnation.
Yes. I mean, my knowledge of it is quite vague, really, and it is picked up from a mixture of mostly Wikipedia and online information, and a couple of friends who actually did see it, and one person I know who was in it, or I used to know, very vaguely. But it was 1975, I believe. Yes, 1975, and it was originally, I think it was a passion of Tim Rice's to create a musical using the Jeeves and Wooster characters. And David Hemmings, the film actor, played the part of Bertie. And it starred other people. It starred David Wood, who's been on Musical Talk as a guest and runs a Whirligig Theatre Company, which is a very successful children's touring theatre company in England. And is also a big musical writer as well. And there was other people there was a Betty Marsden was in it. I'm not sure if these names will ring any bells to yourself or American audiences. I don't know. Is Betty Marsden known over there? So Betty Marsden she was a comedic actress. She was in a lot of the Carry On films, if you're familiar with them. And she was known for radio comedy. The only other time I've known her involved in a musical was she was in Rodgers and Hammerstein's Cinderella when that was staged in London at the Coliseum, and she played the fairy godmother. And she was in this playing Aunt Delilah, I believe, or Aunt Delia. I'll just double check so I can. But she actually got written out and left the show before it opened in London. It was directed by Eric Thompson, who is Emma Thompson's father, and Tim Rice actually left the project. I don't know why, but he left the project. Alan Ayckbourn wrote the lyrics, and Andrew Lloyd Webber wrote the music. The whole production, when it first went on, was about 4.5 hours because they were so dedicated to the source material. And then as it progressed, they actually cut things and shortened it. It had quite a big cast, and there was a cast album created and recorded. And I've heard it, and only 4 of the songs make it into the revised version. A lot of the others were jettisoned, and it's a bit of a chore to listen to. I have to say, so many of the songs are extremely long, and they really do. I mean, they really do sound. It's like the same song is being repeated many, many times. Not even, I would say, to a button effect. The lyrics are very funny. They're very witty. I would say in some cases they're funnier than some of the lyrics that they ended up with in the revisal, which is interesting. But for me, it just doesn't. It doesn't lift when you listen to it. It just doesn't really grab you. Even though I do really enjoy the orchestrations. I'm not going to say too much about it. The story is that Hal Prince informed Andrew Lloyd Webber to buy up and track down all the copies of the record, and so it's now a very rare album to find because he told him take it all back because then you can reuse the music for other shows. And in fact, when you are listening to it, there are quite a few themes and melodies. You go, oh, that's from so and so. So as all composers do, with bottom drawer music, or a lot of composers do or did. So there are a lot of phrases and musical phrases that you do suddenly appear very familiar that you have heard in other Lloyd Webber works later on. There's one
kind of a recurring theme, no pun intended, in criticism of Andrew Lloyd Webber is that he tends to
indeed
recycle his own material and occasionally that of others.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to say anything for sure, but I will, and I kind of have said it before. I mean, and it's a very, there's a very thin line between repeating, I don't want to say plagiarism, but I'm going to say plagiarism or even of yourself, and creating something new. There is one phrase that I was listening to when I was listening to the album, and I thought, oh, that sounds so familiar. He must have used that in something else, and it really sounds. And then I realized it was from a completely different musical from 10 years earlier by a completely different team. It's a musical called Passion Flower Hotel, and there's a phrase in it in the song Something Different, and that is extremely similar to a song in the original production of Jeeves, as it was called then. But I am casting no assertions, as they say.
Well, that is a long and celebrated debate by both fans and critics of Andrew Lloyd Webber, and we'll have
lawyers probably.
We will have occasion to return to that subject as we discuss the subsequent version of the show. But I think it's useful to wrap up our visitation of version 1 by Jeeves, which I believe was just called Jeeves.
Correct. Yes.
And note that despite running 4.5 hours or so in duration, the show only ran for about a month or so before just flopping entirely.
Yes.
There is a positive lesson to be drawn here because after putting in that kind of enormous effort and running into that kind of failure, a composer could easily be forgiven for saying, this was a noble experiment, I'm abandoning it, let's move on and write fabulously successful commercial Broadway musicals.
Yes.
But to his credit, or to the credit of both the writer and composer, they decided decades later, I guess 20 years later, to revisit the show and rework it in a way that would bring out its strengths and capture the spirit of the source material, but present it in a form that audiences might actually like.
Yes, indeed.
I'm
so sorry about that.
That was a perfect punctuation sound effect. Every time I say something clever, I want to hear a vibra slap in the background. Like Foley from a radio show. So the form of the show that our listeners are likely to encounter and that they will see if they look at the broadcast online is the 1996 rewrite, which subsequently had a short Broadway run a few years later. And the version you can see online was a pre-Broadway production that took place at the Pittsburgh Public Theater in 2001.
Yes.
And slightly straddles the threshold between a filmed production and some kind of film presentation. Because as we alluded to earlier, there's a little bit of film-style wrapper material where you have a first-person perspective of a visitor to the show. As we'll discuss, there's kind of a show within a show within a show dynamic, and an imaginary usher brings you to your seat. You briefly go by concessions. So there's a little bit of framing in a film-like style.
Yes.
What I actually think is interesting about filmed productions is that even though they capture some of the qualities of a live stage musical, in that they're continuous. You're seeing one take or one performance. There are some film-like elements. There's one or more cameras, and they can direct our attention to specific people, and they can give us close-ups, and we can see facial expressions with great intimacy. And none of those are possible with live theater. In particular, the directing of the audience's attention, whereas film can do that very literally, theater productions can't. They just have to hope you're looking in the right direction at a given time.
Yes.
So you do get to perceive this in an interesting way. That's a hybrid of film/TV and traditional stage. But this is a much more light on its feet and short production. I think running a more traditional 2-ish hours.
Yes, I believe so. Yes, it does seem to rattle along at quite a good speed.
So let's talk about the present version. There's a bit of a framing device in the show, isn't there?
There is. There's a which I didn't realize, but they did use it in the original production as well. So I thought that was one of the main changes that they would have made to when they revised it. But apparently they did use the device of it's a concert being given for charity. I think they did change where the concert was happening. And Bertie Wooster is the special guest star who's going to play his banjo. But the banjo doesn't arrive, and so he begins to tell an anecdote of a story an event in his life, which is suggested by Jeeves himself. So, but this was a device that was used in the original as well. But I don't think they used. I think once they instigated that, then the flashbacks were very naturalistic, whereas in the new version, we've got another device used, haven't we?
Yes, the premise is, as you said, that we're watching a banjo concert, probably ill-fated from a musical standpoint, because it's implied that Wooster is not a prodigy on the banjo. But we're watching this concert go awry, and in order to occupy the audience in the show, and in real terms to occupy us as well, Wooster is going to tell this story. And the story that he's telling is, of course, the meat and drink of the musical itself. So it's not uncommon to have a musical told as a flashback. But what is a little less common is that the flashback is not presented as a show within a show, but rather it is meant to be reenacted by the people in the present-day banjo concert. So I think the idea is that everyone in the concert is suddenly repurposed to play characters in this story. So even to the point where if you think of the banjo universe as the first Inception-like level, and then the story universe as a second level, people from the banjo concert universe are being repurposed as characters, and they will often identify themselves. They'll say, person XYZ is going to be playing person ABC in this story. So you have essentially people pretending to be actors, pretending to be actors.
Yes, indeed. Yes, it's quite strange. But I didn't realize until I watched it again that the vicar, Stinker, is actually the vicar. So he doesn't change, whereas all the other characters are playing a new role. He's actually playing himself in it, which is quite interesting.
That is a good point. And I feel like sometimes the boundary between the concert universe and the story universe is deliberately made unclear.
Yes.
So that in the middle of this anecdote, Bertie Wooster is meant to be driving a car, and of course they don't have a car handy for this scene, so Jeeves and friends hastily assemble a kind of car out of cardboard boxes, and the banjo universe, Bertie says, I guess I should make some car-like sounds. So we resurface to the outer world of this show and are reminded that it's meant to be some people at a concert reenacting a long story that they strangely have intimate knowledge of.
Yes, it is a very strange hybrid, that, and I've seen it with other shows as well. Another show that uses that is the thriller The Woman in Black. I don't know if you've seen that.
I have.
They use that. They suddenly made the train carriage out of a hamper and various things. But it's very strange in this because some bits I feel work, and then Others don't. And but I do hasten to add that it might have been this production of the show and not the show itself, because there were a couple of things that I thought, oh, that's a bit eggy, but I thought that was probably down to that production and not the show in itself. I can't think of anything specific to mention. So I wish I'd seen another production. So it's interesting because I had the chance once, and I wish I'd seen Stephen Pacey, an English actor playing Bertie Wooster in town here, because he's a wonderful actor, and this Jeeves I didn't quite warm to. I found his accent was not as good as everyone else's, to be honest. But then he's never heard me do an American accent, so
He's better than your Joey.
Well, yes, that's very, very true.
So I think from a big picture level, if we were just to look at the inner story from a bird's eye view,
yes,
we'd say Bertie Wooster is this rich ne'er-do-well, and Jeeves is his dignified, problem-solving butler.
Yes,
who has a kind of an acerbic wit and is an understated sense of humor. And what I infer is that in the books, the idea is that Bertie gets himself entangled in all kinds of shenanigans, and Jeeves steps in and, with great dignity and resourcefulness, invariably saves the day.
Yes.
And that's what happens in this show. So I assume this is the template from which the books were written. The plot concerns a number of romantic schemes, and they're all conveniently located at the same house. And Bertie is lured into them and has a kind of connection to people involved in all these romantic pursuits, and gets dragged into all of them and has to try to fix everybody else's problem. And eventually Jeeves gets called in as the heavy artillery and tries to organize a grand scheme to fix everybody's problem at once.
Yes.
So that's a pretty good synopsis without spoiling any plot details.
Yes, indeed. Absolutely. I think that's absolutely spot on.
I would say this is a light, diversionary kind of musical with a lot of wit and perhaps occasional moments of effective sentiment. A few moments scattered around where we really connect emotionally.
Yes.
How do you feel about it?
Yes, I agree. I think it's, it is a farce, really, and musical farce is always extremely difficult because often the music slows things down. And where I think this is, it doesn't quite hit the mark, I think, for a few things, but I think that it is, I think, so, like you said, some of the emotional moments, a couple of them are quite beautiful, and I think there is my favorite one is, in fact, when the character Honoria Glossop is singing "That Was Nearly Us Back There," and she's singing it in the car, and Bertie's being very comedic and trying to change the subject and ignore what she's saying, but she's actually singing about how they nearly were together. And even though it's comedic, it's very nice and very touching the way that she's putting it across. And then the other great ballad is Half a Moment, which is a bit later on, isn't it? Which is, I think they're beautiful little melodies and quite touching moments.
I'm inclined to agree. I think that the show does not function strongly as a musical because the songs are generally decorative or non-sequitorial.
Yes.
They don't typically fit in intimately in the storytelling, but they kind of accompany the storytelling.
Yes. And they don't quite move it forward. Things do stop for the songs.
Exactly. Now, we're fortunate in that I think melodically, a lot of these tunes are excellent. They are some of the best melody writing I've heard from Andrew Lloyd Webber, and it's strange to hear them in this fairly obscure piece. But a number of these, just as music, linger with me.
Yes, I mean, I do have to admit, I'm not a huge fan of Lloyd Webber's shows, to be honest. I do like Phantom, and this is actually my favourite. By Jeeves is actually my favourite Lloyd Webber show because it's a book musical, and I think that's where he's extremely strong. And I feel it's a shame that there aren't more book musicals by him, because I do like it when he actually creates a standalone song within the book format. For me, where I don't enjoy his stuff so much is when it becomes very recitative and almost operatic. But I do think there's some wonderful numbers in this show. I have a couple of favorites. I have two favorites, but we'll probably get onto those a bit later on.
I might suggest that this show is better experienced as an album experience than as a production. And in part, it's because the album goes out of its way to try and tell you what's going on in the plot in a very unusual fashion. Have you listened to you've heard the recent album?
Oh, is it of the London production? Have you got, or
I don't know if it's of the Broadway cast, but it's of this later version of the show, not the obscure, hard to find, rapidly being censored old version that you referred to.
Yes, I do have it. I have the London one. I think there is a Broadway production cast album as well. When I first heard it, I kind of went, oh, okay, and I left it alone, but then I went back to it and I enjoyed it far more the second time. But I do agree that the device used in the album works extremely well. And in fact, if you've got the London one, you'll hear Stephen Pacey playing Bertie Wooster. But yes, do you want to explain that a bit more?
Yeah, and I'm not sure which version of the album I listened to. I think I listened to whatever showed up on Spotify when I typed by Jeeves into the search field. But what's interesting is that the album alternates the songs in the show with dramatic reenactments of a conversation between Wooster and Jeeves recounting the story. So you get a blow-by-blow synopsis of the story, which is actually not a bad substitute for seeing the show.
Yes.
It omits some level of detail, but it gives you the gist, and it sets up every song. So when you move on to a song, you kind of understand how it's functioning.
Yes. Yes, indeed. I know. I wonder whether... probably isn't, but when I've listened to the original cast album from 1975... whether that was done because it doesn't work so well because everything kind of sounds the same. A lot of the songs that they got rid of. But I mean, you don't have it with other albums. So, but then he has always been very successful with producing these albums that do tell the story, that are what are they called? They have a name, don't they?
Concept albums.
That's it. Yes, he's been very successful in his time with doing that. I think Evita and Jesus Christ Superstar both started out as concept albums, didn't they? Or Jesus Christ Superstar certainly did, but
it did. And in this case, I believe the album was abstracted from the show rather than a prototype that led to the show.
Correct. Yes.
I think it's also worth discussing the lyrics in this case because it's a departure from the partnership we're used to with Andrew Lloyd Webber, which is his collaboration with Tim Rice.
Yes, indeed. And you've got the lyrics by Alan Ayborn, who has been quoted as saying he doesn't like musicals, even though he's written a couple. He wrote this one, and he wrote another show called Suburban Strains, which I've never heard, but that kind of disappeared, I think. So
I think it's also worth circling back to a prior topic with that in mind, in that the songs in this show are often extraneous from the standpoint of storytelling.
Mm-hmm, yes.
And I think we can tie that to the fact that the book writer / lyricist was not a fan of musicals and was clearly trying to write a story that, if push came to shove, could be demusicalized and stand on its own. Yes,
that's a very interesting observation. I think that that could well be the case. I mean, but I've often heard people saying, if you're writing a musical, try to write the play, write it as a play and then put the songs in. I'm not sure whether I always agree with that, but yes, you could say that is the case because, in fact, if you took out all the songs, this would work still.
I think it would literally work if you removed the songs and didn't change a line of dialogue. I don't think you'd miss a single thing.
No, I think there's probably only one song that you would possibly need to have, which is Find the Pig. But everything else could easily just be taken out.
Agreed. Another thing worth mentioning then, so returning to the topic we were encroaching upon before I set us on a side course, I think the lyrics are considerably stronger than what we typically hear with Andrew Lloyd Webber. I feel like there's a lot of perfect rhyme, even predominant use of perfect rhyme.
Yes.
Without the Tim Rice tends to either sacrifice meaning for rhyme or sacrifice rhyme for meaning, and we don't typically hear him nail both. And in this case, though the lyrics were never deep, they were often very clever, and they felt like they were embracing the rhythm of the English language rather than constantly fighting against it.
Yes, I agree. I think there is a tendency with a lot of the songs to have the same rhythm, and I may be wrong there, and I may be remembering it from the original. But I know in the original, when I listened to it, it did sound like all the lines had the same rhyming scheme, but I could be mistaken there. But I think there was only one rhyme that I think I kind of went, oh, that's a bit dodgy, and I can't remember what it is. But it still works, and it's not a bad rhyme. But I think everything else just it goes through you without any horror.
I did note the rhyme of Lucky Charms with circumstance, which regionally might be pronounced closer to circumstance. But in any case, it's kind of a real stretch as far as rhymes go.
Yes. Lucky Charms, circumstance. Yes.
If you're British, it sounds better. But I think that was an exception. I think by and large, the lyrics felt right and the prosody was good. It felt like you could understand what was being said. If you think of the line from the song you alluded to earlier, That Was Nearly Us Back There, the way you would say that in prose or say that aloud is very similar to how those lines are musicalized rhythmically and in terms of the inflection and rise and fall of the melody line.
Yes.
And I think that's partly why that's such a great song, because the words when sung feel natural. They feel like they would feel if they were being spoken aloud. And I think that quality is true whether it's one of the ballads or one of the faster, more pattery songs. There's just a real technical skill in the lyrics that we don't often hear in Andrew Lloyd Webber's songs.
Yes, I agree. There is, let me just try to think. My two favourite songs in the whole show are, did I mention this? Is Love's Maze and Find the Pig. Now, Find the Pig is a little bit of a weird one, which we'll get onto a bit later on. But I do really love Love's Maze. I think it's a really fun song. Where the staging is concerned, I think this is where it doesn't quite hit home, because when I originally listened to the cast album, they mention the fact that they're in this maze and suddenly maids appear in the maze and then gardeners appear in the maze, and they're being and Bertie's being astounded by these characters suddenly appearing in a maze. In the stage show, they just walk on. So you don't really get that feeling of surprise that these ridiculous characters are suddenly appearing in this, that the maid is there dusting a statue or something, because they just suddenly walk on and sing the chorus. However, it does still work, and it's got a lovely feeling of English folk tune about it. In fact, the dancing is very English folk dancing. But I think it's a really fun number, and I
appreciate your observation about the choreography, because if we imagine that the central premise of this song is that love is twisty and full of surprises, you would want some element of surprise to be incorporated into the stage motion.
Well, yes, and I think, and it might have been my projection for after reading the notes in the cast album, because the idea that it says, suddenly a maid appears and then a gardener and Bertie is astounded or whatever. So I'd already had this preconceived idea of this comical event. And so when I saw it, I thought, oh, well, that's not as exciting as I was expecting it to be. So that is me projecting from reading, which it may not have been done like that, or it might have been done in the original production. Like I said, I have no idea if the staging of this show with the recording is the same staging that they used in London, or whether it's a completely redirected show with the same concept.
Fair enough. I also loved this song. I thought it was melodically very strong and lifts your spirits in a moment of the story that definitely needs it at this point. It's also at the same time a good example of how the songs don't really function to advance the narrative of the story.
Yeah.
To point out some missed opportunities. In this moment in the story, a character who is perhaps somewhat unfortunately named Stiffy is trying to recruit Bertie into another one of the various romantic schemes. So you might imagine this is Stiffy's opportunity to sing some kind of active recruitment song, join a board, or I'm going to blackmail you unless you help me. But instead she launches into essentially a digression that's very general about love being kind of circuitous and confusing. And that song really could appear in any musical at almost any moment where there's a romance. So it's not particular to this moment or this character or this show.
And it's a shame because that character's Stiffy is a great character, because she's all the female parts are great in this, but she has this edge where she's tiny, but she's solid, and she knows what she wants, and she's out to get it, and she's quite prepared to go through anything in order to get what she wants. And so the strange thing is, this and her other song, Half a Moment, are the two. Half a Moment's a great lyric duet, romantic duet. And so it is strange that those two songs don't quite have the guts that her character has. And like you said, it would be quite fun if she had more of an edge to the song, if she was trying to, threaten him in some way, because she's certainly got that in her character.
I agree. There are so many opportunities here for perhaps a song that appears to be an act of persuasion, but subtextually is actually a very funny form of blackmail or threatening, which is what's happening in the dialogue in this scene. And as you observe, Stiffy's a really fun character who's very driven and motivated and has her own needs and is interfering with Bertie's life. I mean, that's the formula for a good song.
And in fact, the lead up to the song starting is very similar, suggesting that. And then suddenly she starts to sing in the song, and then it's just about her feelings, which is a little bit of a letdown, but it's a great number, so you kind of forgive it.
Yeah, absolutely. As music, I love it. It's just fun to listen to. I feel like it's Andrew Lloyd Webber at his best.
Mm-hmm.
Half a Moment is the more slower tempo ballad that happens in Act 2 and is meant to be a little more sentimental, a little less comedic, though perhaps there's a lyric or two that's droll as well. There's talking again about Andrew Lloyd Webber's recycling of his own music. There was a moment in the song that struck me as similar to a moment in Memories from Cats.
Oh, really? I didn't pick up on that, but yes, I'm not a musician.
I can't remember the exact lyric. I think if you listen to it again with that in mind, you'll hear it. There's,
right, yes.
Kind of smack in the middle of the chorus. Well, Memories is all chorus, but smack in the middle of that line, there's just one very distinct chord shift. I think it's to the 4 chord, and it's just sounds like an echo of that moment. Uh-huh. But that aside, it's also a lovely tune, and one of the few that feels unreservedly heartfelt.
Yes, although in this production they do put in odd comedic moments, which I think is... And again, that could be the production, the direction, or whatever, but it did feel suddenly out of place there. And I don't think they needed it. I think they could have quite happily just had the the love duet as it was, and have a comedic end to it. But they do put in a couple of jokes in the middle of the song, visual jokes, which I didn't think were necessary personally.
I think by and large, the production and the material itself both do a good job of balancing the needs of comedy and sentiment. If we accept that the show itself is a bit of a frivolously styled piece,
yes,
and needs to alternate between those two moods, generally, I think they manage to do a good job.
Yes, I agree, and I'm being very overpicky with some of my thoughts about it, but I think that's also me looking at it and feeling some of the gags I felt didn't quite land, but I thought that was because it's interesting, because I wondered, especially, and this was what I was going to ask you, is because there are moments in it that I felt the humor was very, very British, kind of niche British, and there were moments which happened in the show. This sounds terribly rude. I do apologize, but there were moments when I was watching the show and I suddenly thought, oh, they've missed that there because they haven't done it in the British way, and it's a kind of interesting thought, because I thought that's that's unfair, but at the same time there were certain lines that I went, oh, that should have worked, but it would have only worked if it had been done that way, and that didn't seem to be in the way it was meant to be done.
So you're saying, if I understand you correctly, that there were certain tropes of comedy that are common in British culture that may have been lost in the translation in an American production.
Yes, exactly. Yes, that's exactly what I was saying. I don't know why I was going around the houses there, but that's absolutely right. There were certain tropes there, or certain things that I felt were very British, and they'd been Americanized, or that not Americanized. Sorry, they'd been missed because they didn't quite understand the
tradition.
The tradition. That's correct. Yes. I don't know. Yeah. I can't give you an example either. I'm sorry. So.
Well, by definition, I can't perceive the things you're talking about, so I'll have to trust your expertise on this particular subject.
Yeah. Well.
Were there any other songs you think are worth mentioning?
Let me just think. No, even though I like them.
Well, I'm gonna point out one that I think deserves some attention, in addition to the ones we've already mentioned, and that is "Travel Hopefully," which happens early-ish in the show.
Yes,
and is again a case of something happens in the show and people are going to somewhat redundantly sing about the thing that's happened or is happening. So it's really a decorative song. It's not. There are things that happen during the song that advance the plot, but if you were just to listen to the sung lyrics, you wouldn't get any sense of forward motion in the story.
It's actually that's one of the songs that was in the original as well. I should point that out.
Well, I'm glad that it survived, because I think it's just another case of being very tuneful, very melodic, and bringing a kind of levity of spirit that is part of this show's charm. So if I had to vote for my favorite song among several that I liked a lot, this would probably win the race by a head.
Oh, that's really interesting. I think I love the way it's staged. It's actually one of my least favorite songs in the whole show. And it's very strange, that, isn't it? So
I guess we're going to have to fight now.
Yeah, we are. Yeah, fisticuffs from across the airwaves. That's fascinating. The original version of it, I felt the lyrics were wittier, and I think they've been rewritten. So the tunes there and the concept of the same place in the story it's in the same place as the story. But some of the original, mind you, in the original production, it kind of goes on for about 10 minutes, I feel.
That might cure me of my love for the song if I hear a 10-minute version.
I have to see if I can find it. So
I agree that the lyrics are fluffy and absolutely meaningless. In this case, I think that's departure from the wit that's in the lyrics of many of the other songs. I think they're literally just filling the syllable space with words that rhyme. But despite that, to me, there's a kind of charm and joy of travel that's conveyed by the song, and just as a musical moment that really resonates with me.
Oh, that's good. Yes, I do agree. It does have that. It has a very carefree feel to it, which is important for the story, actually. So, and in fact, they split it up, don't they? Because he's driving and then he has the accident and runs over, spoiler, but he runs over someone, and then they continue on the journey and sing the song together. So it does have a progression plot-wise. And it does have some very fun choreography and moments in it with the various... I do like the moment where they come out pulling the bits of lawn with hedgehogs on it, and then they retreat backwards and it looks like the car is speeding along the road. So that actually is very clever. So as I'm talking about it, I'm being completely hypocrite and thinking, oh no, I did quite enjoy that after all.
It's also a really funny moment in the story because Bertie happens upon, in several senses, a friend of his, and Bertie says, "Whatever you're doing out here," and it turns out that there is some kind of movement to protect hedgehogs from the, I guess, newly invented phenomenon of automobiles running them over.
Yes.
So a number of pedestrians are out on the roadways protesting, and I forget the name of the character who Bertie hits with his car and then picks up.
Bingo Little.
Thank you.
Who was played by David Wood, the actor David Wood, actor, and he's an English producer, actor, children's writer, very prolific.
Interesting.
So, and he's been a guest on musicals many times. He was originally played Bingo Little in the original production, not in the revival. Sorry.
Got it. This current video does not present an opportunity to see him.
No, sorry. Yes, I got that wrong.
Well, I don't know how I managed to forget a name like Bingo Little, but I did. But the funny thing is that Bertie asks Bingo, like, what are you doing out here on the road? And it turns out he is trying to win over Honoria.
Honoria, yes.
Win over her heart. And she is very involved in this movement to protect the hedgehog. So he's kind of out there tromping around, trying to follow her and show her that he's a good person. And he ends up traveling in a car. And then they come across Honoria herself. So it's a very funny progression from the standpoint of plot. And I think this is a case where the song is elevated by the scene rather than the other way around.
Yes, I would agree. And in fact, that way around, yes, I do agree completely. And I'm being, like I said, I'm being completely hypocritical because you're completely convincing me now. And I absolutely agree. The song is enhanced by what's happening. I think maybe my thoughts are from hearing it on the cast album. It does come across as a little bit of a breezy song, and so you really have to see that staged in order to get that feeling. Or certainly that's how my brain works anyway.
Do you want to share your thoughts on It's a Pig, since you mentioned that earlier?
It's a Pig. First of all, I just want to go back, because this will include, but did you recognize Honoria Glossop?
The actress, you mean?
Yes.
I don't have your thespian's eye for recognizing talent.
Well, I thought, gosh, she looks like someone very familiar to me. And then I looked it up online, and it certainly was. It is an actress called Donna Lynn Champlin, who plays Paula in the Crazy Ex-Girlfriend.
You're kidding me.
No. So
how could I not have recognized her after watching every episode of that show?
I know, it was amazing, but it only struck me when I was watching it today. So it was fascinating. I thought she looks very much like the actress who plays Paula. And then I looked it up and it was the same actress. And she really is fantastic. I think she's just the most wonderful musical theatre performer. And she's very good in By Jeeves, and she's excellent in My Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. She's one of those performers I would go and see a musical because she was in it. She would be a name that would pull me in, I think. So, but yeah, that was very exciting. And she has quite a main part in Find the Pig. So the idea of Find the Pig is I suppose the 11th hour number, really, isn't it? Well, no, I suppose Banjo Boy is, but Well, Banjo Boy's the finale. Well, anyway, it's the culmination of all the farcical elements. And if any song is very much about the plot and the moment and telling the story with the song, it is probably Find the Pig more than any other song in the show. It is Bertie has broken into the house in an elaborate scheme set up by Stiffy in order to burgle the house and be tackled by her boyfriend, who will then prove to be a hero, and then she'll be allowed to marry who she wants. So Bertie gets roped into this, and he steals into the house dressed in a pig mask. Unfortunately, goes into the wrong bedroom, which is Honoria's, and wakes up the entire household. And while he is trying to deal with this, they're singing the song Hunt the Pig, which is a biggish chorus number where they're all getting more and more ridiculous, and doors are opening and closing, and Bertie's trying to escape, and very much in the vein of the one that I liken it to and wish it was more. It built more is from the musical On the 20th Century. Okay, it's probably the best musical farce that was ever written. Cy Coleman wrote the music. Compton and Green wrote the book, based on a stage play. And there's a song in it called She's a Nut, which is probably about 4 or 5 minutes. And it builds and builds and builds, and it is a crazy chase song number where everybody gets involved, and it builds and builds and builds and builds and builds, and it is probably the best example of a chase farcical number I think ever written. It's absolutely brilliant, and it has a repetitive phrase as well, which never seems to get boring. That's what I wanted Hunt the Pig to become. But I feel it just stops short. It kind of builds and I get very excited, and then suddenly, just when you're getting really excited, the whole thing slows down to one of those quiet moments. And there is a musical term for that, isn't there? But I can't remember. I might be wrong. Do you know that?
Subito piano. I can't
possibly
think of.
When a chorus suddenly start singing a chorus very hushed, it's slightly different than this, I suppose. Again, it builds again, but it never. I always wanted more characters to get involved until everybody's on the stage and it's all getting really frantic. And for me, it doesn't quite pay off. It gives that promise of it and then doesn't deliver. Because I think it's a great fun number. I think it's got very funny lyrics. I don't like the idea that the mask gets stuck and he can't take it off, because I'm thinking, well, how is a mask stuck and it can't get off? So that's one of those bits that kind of grates on me, but that's it's quite a minor point, really. But you have some thoughts on Hunt the Pig, though, don't you? Which I hadn't thought about until you mentioned.
Well, first off, I agree with your assessment that it's a fun song and there was room to grow as well. And it maybe fell short of the level of climacticity that it could have achieved. Yeah. Musically, it's a lot of fun, but musically, I also note a more than passing resemblance to Be Our Guest from Beauty and the Beast.
Be our guest. Hunt the pig.
Hunt our pig. Yeah, exactly. The rhythms are almost interchangeable in spots, and in part, I think it's because they're both using a kind of French can-can kind of trope musically.
Right.
So there's a standard chord progression and rhythm, and for all we know, both of those songs are based on some third, even earlier song. But in this case, it's hard to listen to this and not hear it as being uncomfortably close from the standpoint of melody.
Yes, that it is interesting, because then, as you were saying that, I suddenly thought, oh, is that the same as She's a Nut? Which is the song from On the 20th Century, which the title is 3 syllables again. She's a nut, hunt the pig, be our guest. I don't think that is. I think that's pure coincidence. But yes, it's interesting.
Also, Les Poissons from The Little Mermaid falls in this category as well.
Yes, it does. Oh, dear.
That was a little more like a waltz and a little less like a frantic can-can number, but these are all cut from the same cloth musically.
Yes, that's interesting. And I wonder whether that's because if it does demand that, which is that build, and I mean certainly Be Our Guest builds, as we all know, it's the epitome of the Disney build number, really, isn't it?
And it is reprised as underscore in the big climactic showdown in Beauty and the Beast.
Yes, you're right.
So it has that quality of also being the 11 hour plus 15 minutes, big, crazy, everything coming together number in its instrumental form that It's a Pig is in song form in this show.
You use it instrumentally at one point. I did notice there was something. I think before it, the band actually play the theme before the song actually happens at one moment, and I can't think where. It didn't quite grab me. If it ever does get reworked again, I would love to see Hunt the Pig get bigger, really, because I think if it got bigger, I think the crowd would just go wild if there was just every single character got involved and and it just build, rather than just those 4 or 5 characters, because it would be, you could have maids running in and screaming or whatever, and I just think it would just be a wonderful. You shall have to listen to On the 20th Century and hear She's a Nut, which is an incredible number of the way it builds, and as every character gets involved, and the comedic element of it is that they're actually repeating the same information but to different characters, and as they do that, it just gets bigger and bigger and more absurd. In the original production, I think, because it is I'm sorry, I'm going off on a weird tangent here, but in the original production, they have, because they're all hunting this one character, they actually had, in between the scenes in the song, while it was musically happening, they had the character appearing, holding onto the front of the train, running as it was coming out towards the audience, and she's meant to be there clinging onto the front of the engine, and then that turned around and she was on the back of the engine waving a flag. So and it's that's one of the things that it reminded me of, and so again, that's what I would love to see with Hunt the Pig, or we'll see what happens. I don't think that will happen, but it's nice to put it out there.
Well, the show does have a history of significant revision.
Yes.
So it's not impossible to imagine that a future version of the show might make some further improvements.
Yes, indeed. And I think it is, because it's also musically, it's very different from a lot of the other numbers in the show. It's very musical theatre. And I really do enjoy it when Andrew Lloyd Webber really writes musical comedy, and I think when he does write that, he really does produce something great. Sometimes the shows which are so ballad heavy, I'm not a big ballad person anyway, so I mean, and the majority of the audience who see his stuff adore him for his ballads and the beautiful lyric ballads, but for me it's always the more musical comedy traditional songs that I kind of lift up with his stuff, like Herod's song in Jesus Christ Superstar, and the letters in Phantom of the Opera, for example. Those are my favorite numbers from those shows. So yeah.
And I think By Jeeves does do a pretty good job of keeping things light on their feet and not drowning us in too many slow moments. And as we discussed, the sentimental moments are often have counterpoint of humor, so that we are always reminded that we're in a comedy.
Yes, although I think when you watch it and not necessarily when you listen to it, which is I think why it didn't really grab me when I first heard it, and listening to the original cast album, there are a lot of the lyrics were more comedic than they became in the later revisal, where I think the comedy comes from what's actually happening on stage.
So I'll ask you for a judgment that of the two of us, you are the only one equipped to make. Would you suggest to our listeners that they watch the streamed performance, that they listen to the more recent album or one of them, or that they listen to the difficult to find original cast
Heavens
album?
no.
Which of these experiences do you recommend?
I do not recommend going and listening to the original cast album if you can find it. I think there's a good reason why it was all bought up and disappeared. It is a collector's piece. I think if you're interested in the show and you're interested in Lloyd Webber, I think that would be, you'll probably enjoy hunting that down. However, from the standpoint of the show, I feel it could have a detrimental effect. You actually commented, I think, on one of our text chats, so you were listening to the album again, the recent cast album, and you said it feels like the whole show at double time. And then I commented, well, if you listen to the original album from 1975, it feels like the whole show doubled up, So I personally would recommend watching it rather than listening to the cast album. But that is if you are wired as my head is wired, which is that I'm not the greatest Andrew Lloyd Webber fan with his shows. So I need it. When I've seen them, I always enjoy them. But when I've listened to the cast albums, I have to say they don't really do much for me. But that's because I'm not somebody who is really turned on by ballads. I like the musical comedy numbers. Whereas I think if you are a big Lloyd Webber fan and you like his music, then I think you could come at it from either the cast recording or watching the televised version. Is that vague enough for you? What would you suggest?
I think the more recent album, or one of them, if my understanding that there's two recordings is correct, definitely should be something worth listening to, especially because it presents the plot in narrated form in a very nice, compressed way. So you get the gist of the story and you get all the lovely tunes. As for the production, I'm a little bit torn. There's a lot of fun comedic interpretation in that presentation that you obviously can't get from a non-visual album. But it does take a while to build up momentum. I feel like the framing device of being at a concert is very tedious at the start, and there's a long wait before you really get into the plot and start caring about what happens to anyone. So if you're a big fan of musical theater, as I imagine many of our listeners are, and you don't mind a visual experience that's a little bit protracted and is of mixed virtues, then I'd say, sure, check it out. But definitely listen to the album either way, because this is a more obscure work of Andrew Lloyd Webber that nonetheless has a lot of musical merit, and it's just a fun listen. The songs are just entertaining and rewarding.
Yes, I think that's probably a good... I agree with that. I feel that first 5 minutes of the setup can feel a bit eggy. I think one of the reviews said that when they were watching it recently online, they did feel that the audience was sat there a little bit embarrassed. But then they warmed up through the show. I think that's probably an unfair judgment, but I do kind of know what they mean. So there was an interesting moment in the show, though, where, because they show a lot of the times they show the audience, so some people are really laughing hysterically at the action and really enjoying it, which is an absolute joy to see. But there's one moment in the show which was very strange, because they only decided to do it once, which was I think the end of Act 1, what would be, which is where they're addressing Bingo, I think, on stage. And Bertie is looking at Wooster, and suddenly you're looking at Bertie as if you are Bingo, and then suddenly you're looking at Bingo as if you are Bertie or the other characters, and they're looking directly into the character. And that's the only time it happens in the whole film, which is a very odd choice. And I'm not sure why they did that. Do you remember it?
I remember it now that you mention it. And yes, that particular cinematographic technique is just used that one time. But that moment, if I remember, doesn't have enough significance to warrant a sudden changing of our point of view.
Yes, I know. It is a bit strange. I mean, that's a directorial choice, isn't it? But it is an odd moment. This is something this has been a criticism. This was a criticism for the original production, and I think it's been a criticism for the revisal as well. And I'd be interested to know what you think. Which is, Jeeves doesn't really have a song. Well, he certainly doesn't have a solo song, and he doesn't really sing, which is odd for a show which is called Jeeves or by Jeeves.
Well, that's a very good observation. He does have a little bit of a patter break in in a somewhat contrived conflict song.
Yeah.
But he never has any numbers. And I think this highlights one of the challenges of musicalizing a story like this. Because if a character is going to sing, they have to want something very badly, or they might have to want to avoid something very badly. They have to have an opinion. And Jeeves, by nature, being so reserved and dry, cannot have the kind of passionate opinions that lead to songs.
Yes, that's an interesting thought.
So it's kind of a pickle.
Yes.
When the only moment he has is when there's this brief period of contention between Wooster and Jeeves, and Wooster is suddenly essentially accusing Jeeves of messing everything up and not satisfactorily coming to the rescue of the situation. And Jeeves gets a little bit huffy and self-defensive and passive-aggressive and basically says, I did the best that I could. And this is the closest he ever comes to expressing a strong emotion. So it's not surprising that that would be his one little musical moment. But that's it for him. So he becomes a bit of an emotional cipher, and he can't be a linchpin of the story the way we would expect a major character in a musical to be.
Yes, I agree. And in fact, because of his calm demeanor, in fact, if he actually had a song, it certainly would slow things down, because you couldn't, that's the only place where you could have a song. And yes, it almost, the character cries out for it in some ways. I don't know what the answer is. I was trying desperately to think through other musical theatre characters who are similar.
I think the only way you could have musicalized him effectively, and I don't think this is a great idea, but it's the only way it could have been done, is either to turn him into a narrator, in which case he can be a presentational character who is singing about the world rather than anything that's kindling emotions in him. Or he could have had a moment of quiet reflection where he reflects that he has a paternalistic relationship with Bertie and deeply cares for him, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that would have been awful from the standpoint of tone of the show.
Yes, I agree.
So it would have been possible, but a bad idea.
I thought of a third option as well, which is actually at the Great Denouement, where everyone's on stage and you've got all the mistaken characters or whatever. You could have had a really good patter number where Jeeves explains it all and actually sorts out the whole situation, which is what he usually doesn't quite happen in this version of the story. That he just comes in and he takes off, he spins the fountain around. That is solved in the outer story rather than how do they solve it in the real story, because they wouldn't have been able to do that because they're swapping places. So it's very strange that the whole answer to the whole solution to the farcical scenario that they've all found themselves in is solved using something from the which is not part of the story, and which is strange because also the whole joy about the Jeeves and Wooster stories is that Jeeves always saves the day. So although he saves the day, he's not actually doing it in the reality of the narrative that's being told. So that is a bit strange thing.
I am also briefly reminded of the musical Dirty Rotten Scoundrels that does have a song that is given to a butler-like character, and it's kind of neither here nor there emotionally. It's just a song of disdain, and it just doesn't work.
Oh, do you mean the monkey in the suit?
Exactly.
Yes, I know what you mean. It's oh, let's give this character a number, and it's fine, but
A disdainful character doesn't really have anything to sing about that we care about unless somehow their disdainfulness is integral to the fate of someone we like. So it's a tough nut to crack.
And you've got to like Jeeves as well, for all his aloofness. You have to like it. You can't have anything where you start feeling against Jeeves.
It's also worth noting on this topic that Bertie himself doesn't have a lot to present in song. We have his opening number is a very general anthem about a can-do spirit. And it doesn't have a whole lot to do with this particular story. It's almost it's almost a little bit like Comedy Tonight, an introductory mood setting song.
Yes, I agree. It is quite prevalent, that of the Jeeves and Wooster stories. So the code of the Woosters is one of the main things that always drives Bertie Wooster's motives. So I think that was putting it in there to satisfy the Jeeves and Wooster's fans and the Wodehouse fans, because that's actually quite important for his character. But it does seem to go on a bit, that one.
And there is a payoff a little bit later when I think Jeeves, outside of music, mentions the code as a way of reminding Bertie to stay the course and not give up.
Well, it's a kind of emotional blackmail, which is used, it is used in the to effect in the books as well.
And I give it credit for that, and I think that's effective. But even still, when first presented, it doesn't have much weight because it's Bertie essentially bragging about something. He's bragging about his character, but not giving us any evidence of that. So it's almost more narrative showmanship than. Anyway, I'm splitting hairs.
Well, no, it is. I think it is a case of them putting it in there because they kind of had to, if you know what I mean. So because that's it. So it's a little bit shoehorned in. So yes, I know what you mean.
So to rise back to the bird's eye view as we conclude, I think the consensus here is that the show and production have mixed virtues, but we both like the music.
Yes.
And can heartily recommend the later albums at least, and perhaps to those who are a little more patient, the show itself, the production that was offered by Andrew Lloyd Webber.
Yes, correct. And I mean, it is great that these are being shown, and it is good fun, and it's very different from a lot of other Andrew Lloyd Webber stuff. So it is good to see something else. I do want to mention there's a couple of other things I want to. There's something I've just discovered, which is very interesting, which is that the tune of "It's a Pig" appeared with different lyrics as a unsuccessful pop song in 1977. So it predates "Be Our Guest." So "Be Our Guest" is the and it was known as Magdalena, and it was sung by the singer Tony Christie. And then my other one I was going to mention, because I'd like to know your thoughts on this, is the finale, which is Banjo Boy. Because we haven't talked about Banjo Boy, and that's one of the main crux of the show, really, isn't it?
I would say, yeah, Banjo Boy wraps up the outer story, the ostensible reason we're there, which is to see this ill-fated banjo concert. And it's a bit of high-energy frivolity at the end. It doesn't really pertain to anything we care about, because everything we care about takes place in the inner story, the story within the story.
Yes.
So it's a bit of fun, but it's not functional as music.
Yes, and then they have this weird thing where they all come on dressed in Wizard of Oz costumes, which are meant to be the costumes that were backstage. For some reason that grated on me. Sorry, I do apologise. I hope that hasn't come out on the recording. And then they do and I kind of wish they didn't do it, but they did the traditional thing, mega mix at the end, and that is one of those things you just go, oh, stop it, just stop it, just end it properly. But they have to do the mega mix, which is it kind of irritated me a little bit, but that's just me being pernickety, I think. So
it might have been more typical in a time where you couldn't rely on the easy availability of a soundtrack recording. So there might have been a desire to make sure everyone remembered all the tunes that they had just heard.
Yes. The way you worded that sounded scary. I don't know why. I kind of broke out in a bit of a sweat.
It seems like a commercial move, which, given the music technology at the time and how music was consumed, had a little bit of shrewdness to it, but I agree with you. It's a little grating today.
Yes, maybe that's what it is. It's now we don't tend to do it, unless it is Joseph.
Well, speaking of shows that ran on too long, I think we're probably at the boundary of our discussion today.
Yes, we are, yes. Well, it's been a pleasure, and we do recommend that people hunt it out, and if you can find the original production, cast recording, then give it a listen to. It is interesting. They've included a character which they got rid of, which is a wonderful character called Spode, who is a pastiche of Oswald Mosley, the fascist kind of political leader in England during the Second World War. And he's a kind of satire on him in the Jeeves and Wooster books. So, but he's in the original production, but he got jettisoned for this production. Which is
those who ignore your dire warning not to listen to the original album will be able to encounter that character.
Yes,
and see
indeed.
What he's about.
Yes. Oh, and sorry, I'm rattling on as well, but there is one thing I should have mentioned. But of course, the P.G. Wodehouse did actually meet with Lloyd Webber and Alan Ayckbourn and gave his permission, and they talked about the production. And of course, P.G. Wodehouse was no stranger to writing musicals himself. I think he wrote lyrics and book for quite a few Broadway shows, didn't he? Including material for Showboat, I believe. So I know Leave It to Jane is one of his, I believe. And he wrote quite a bit with Guy Bolton. But yes, I believe that he did write material for one of the many hundred versions of Showboat.
I didn't know he had that kind of pedigree. Very interesting.
Yes, indeed.
Well, very good. Probably we're at the part we should wrap.
Yes.
So thank you for a lovely conversation, and I hope we have spread some interest in this particular oddball show.
Indeedy. Yes, let's hope so. Marvelous. Thank you very much.
All right. Till next time.
Yes. Take care, Michael.
For more information about Musical Talk, please visit our website at musicaltalk.co.uk. You can email us at feedback@musicaltalk.co.uk, listen to past episodes on iTunes and YouTube, and follow our social media channels on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.